Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins Truergy, also known as Byron of Sidious. This is American Minotaur, written by yours truly, Joshua T. Calkins Truergy. Chapter 12. There was a dull throb in his left arm from the tattoo, but otherwise Titus awakened on Monday morning feeling prepared for whatever the world decided to throw in his path. In an odd way, the fellow telling you good readers his tale finds himself a little jealous of that sense of nigh invulnerability. For God's sakes, said storyteller can't get out of bed in the morning some days without a dozen little klaxon alarms blaring in his skull that this or that joint or muscle cluster is in dire need of either stretching or industrial-grade painkillers, stat. But let us away from that unpleasantness and back to the young Minotaur. This is his story, after all. When he got down to the kitchen and poured his first cup of coffee, he found his mom sat at the kitchen table, her Kindle propped up on a little plastic stand she'd picked up at Target, so that she could do her morning reading hands-free. "What you reading, Mom?" he inquired, taking a seat with her. "Oh, it's called Grappling Fear, something that got recommended in one of my book club groups on Facebook," Linda replied. "I'm not very far in yet. I'm a little confused, though." "About what?" "Well, the perspective keeps changing between the two primary protagonists," she said. "But the shift isn't clearly differentiated. They're brothers, and the two of them are getting into this small, independent wrestling circuit as a tag team, which seems to make perfectly good sense, thematically," she went on. "But the whole story is told in first-person perspective, with each brother having their own sections." "Okay, got it. But then, how's the author showing the shift from one brother to the other?" "Well, that's just it, son. There really aren't any demarcation marks, no page break or asterisks or anything, really. It's a little jarring." Titus tried to imagine what trying to read George Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire novels might have been like if there hadn't been character names at the start of each chapter, but he realized that this wasn't quite the same thing, since those tales were all told in third-person, omniscient perspective. "Indie book?" "Yes, still trying to stay on that trend for now. The larger traditional publishing houses have gotten lazy, Titus, taking in and pushing out the most low-level trash," she said, shaking her head. Titus did a double take. His mom didn't usually talk like this. "She hasn't had her full dose of caffeine yet, though. That makes a difference." Instead of saying anything, he used his own mug to gently slide hers closer to her hand. As she went to turn the page on her device, her finger bumped her mug and Linda took it in hand and drained off half of her cup. "I'm sorry, dear. Did you want me to make you anything for breakfast?" "No, Mom. That's a weekends only thing. I'll just grab a bowl of cereal for now." He got up and fetched it, and as he sat down, he winced slightly as his sweater rubbed against his fresh tattoo. Magic might have been responsible for its introduction to his flesh, but the pain of recovery and healing would have to be undergone through the everyday, mundane process of nature. He would have to be careful about it at practice that afternoon. When Titus got to his first class a couple of hours later, he made his request rather sheepishly, though his professor proved more than willing to help him out once more. "It doesn't need to be as thorough as the request I made about Sutek, you understand," Titus pointed out. "This guy's just someone my biological father used to associate with, a name he mentioned the other day when he dropped in for a visit." "Totally understandable, Mr. Jacobson," the former forensics expert said. "Given you don't need it to be as deep a sweep, I should have something for you by tomorrow afternoon at the latest." Titus thanked him, then headed to his seat among the risers, settling in for the day's lecture. To his enjoyment, his forensic sciences professor wheeled in a portable lab setup to perform a small demonstration for his students, letting them watch the various included machines go through processing bits of evidence that he had included from home, to give them a better understanding of the actual hands-on procedure of examining what technicians brought in from various crime scenes. Walking towards his next class, Titus tried to think of all of the variables that the professor had underscored and emphasized as he walked the students through the process. How vital it was that absolutely everything presented for analysis be controlled and contained, that every step along the chain of custody be factored in. Environmental contamination of samples, for instance, proved to be incredibly difficult to maintain the integrity of if something were moved about in an uncontained fashion before arriving at a laboratory for examination. Dozens of cases, according to his professor, had been thrown out just in the Erie County court system over the last 4 years, simply because some crime scene technician had improperly moved or stored some piece of material that could have been vital to a case's conviction. It was a hefty thing to consider, and Titus gave it its due as he made his way to his statistics and reporting class. Excerpt from The Greatest Resource by Harlan Floescone. The Greatest Resource is a 2022 nonfiction book written by Harlan Floescone, an elven native of Chaldea. Well known in his homelands as a magical scholar, he worked for close to 20 years with the United States Department of Justice to help develop and enforce various policies and practices regarding the deployment of magic by Chaldeans brought to Earth during the Outworld incidents, as well as by Earthborn descendants of such persons. Originally considered for a position with the Department of Defense, the evidence of magic's massive reduction in scale of range and power once users were here on Earth shifted most nations' focus on the potential for international magical conflict to internal strife and criminal conduct on a national or territorial level at worst. The following passage is from the 5th chapter of his work, published in 2017 by Parker Books Limited. When most humans born and raised on Earth hear that there were humans from Chaldea dragged into this world during the Outworld incidents, most of them react with a certain level of incredulity. How could we possibly tell them apart from everyday Earth humans, they often ask. The answer for a magic user is simple enough. We simply deploy the gift known as mana sight and search for the native aura of mana wafting around the hume in question, since they are still touched by a mild patina of the energies from the home world of Chaldea. For any offspring they bear into the world, that patina remains, but it is so subtle as to only be detectable with the use of mana sight within 10 feet or closer. The simple other test would have to be a Kenin, Felis, or Gotrin sniff them, and they'd know almost without fail. Chaldean native humans have a slightly elevated concentration of iron in their blood than Earth-born humans, researchers have learned, though this concentration does not get passed on to their offspring. Magic, however, has its own scent, which would still make this a valid test measure. The fact that there is so much less mana in the wild here on Earth than there was on Chaldea has been something of a sore subject for those of us who relied heavily on the use of magic for our professions and everyday lives back home. As such, when rumors began circulating back around 2010 that there had been small springs of mana showing up in random locations around the world, some Chaldean natives abruptly dropped whatever they were doing in search of these. It turned out to be a little more than the Hume's eternal search for the creature known as Bigfoot for a little while. However, in 1998, 2 such outlets of magical energy concentration were discovered, one in southern Mexico and one just outside of Moscow, Russia. However, shortly after Chaldean-born magic users were allowed to draw power from these, both sources seemed to simply evaporate, as if completely used up. As of the time I am writing this work, no more such mana springs have been officially recorded or documented, only spoken of in the same kind of hushed conspiratorial whispers as one typically associates with fringe theory folks like the ever-popular Alex Jones. He's an interesting Hume, one who likely would have been quite at home in my native Chaldea. This loss of magical potency here on Earth has certainly been a boon to a couple of the races that have become part of this world since the Outworld incidents, particularly the Minotaurs and lizard men. Men and women of both of these races have historically been less adapted to magic, though the shamans of their peoples are said to be extraordinarily talented in both raw magical power and the wisdom required to wield it appropriately. Despite my personal disagreement with the primary religions of Minotaurs and lizard men, I cannot deny that the rites and rituals their shamans utilize seem to render tangible results, seemingly gifted by the very gods and goddesses they invoke. Yet these faiths of theirs are little known to the humans of Earth, closely guarded now even against their fellow Chaldeans, including my own people. Given the history of ideologically driven wars over the course of humanity's history here, perhaps it is even further proof of the wisdom of these faith-based magic wielders. Why invite trouble where there's already more than enough of it for all involved? For the love of God, Coach Reynolds muttered, pressing his fingers to his temples. All right, you know what? I asked you to step up, and you can still do it, he said, grabbing a spare clipboard, sticking a couple of laminated sheets on it, and grabbing a copy of the defensive playbook for the Bengals. From one of his desk drawers, he withdrew a spare whistle on a lanyard, and with it coiled on top of the playbook and clipboard, he offered the stack to Titus, who stood across the desk from him with his sweater half off, his tattoo puffed and inflamed on his arm. It had started to itch after his first lecture, and though he hadn't made the mistake of scratching it, it was starting to mildly burn. The application of Neosporin had helped, but he could tell that any impact or grab on it during practice would fell him to his knees in a hurry. As such, he came to Coach Reynolds a little before practice was set to start to see if there was an alternative. Run your program, sir? You're fucking A-right, run my program, Reynolds barked, hands on his hips. It was probably only the second or third time in all his years playing for the school that Titus had felt himself on the receiving end of the man's anger. What the hell were you thinking, Titus? Is that thing going to be healed up enough to play on Saturday? I'll be able to play, sir, Titus said, pulling his arm back through his sleeve with a grimace. Good. Now, I have to ask, Reynolds said, seeming to deflate back toward his normal affability. What the hell inspired it? Titus tried to explain the set of Minotaur rituals Ashgar had taken him to undertake, to try connecting to his people's roots and ways of life, crash course though it was. When he was finished, Reynolds snapped his fingers, his eyes briefly widening. That reminds me about your folks, he said, opening one of his desk drawers and pulling out a scarf and a pair of gloves that Titus recognized as his dad's. Your dad left these behind on the bleachers the last home game. I know they're his. He's been wearing the same ones since he started playing for us. Titus took the scarf and gloves, putting them in his duffel on the way out to the field. Running a defensive unit's practice drills from the coaching position proved slightly more cumbersome for Titus's attentions than he initially would have assumed. When he was halfway through the drill time, however, he reconsidered his strategy, adapting it to be something akin to a commanding officer doling out patrol and investigation assignments to a street enforcement unit. By the time everyone headed back into the locker rooms, Coach Reynolds clapped him on the back between the shoulders and said, "Not bad for a first run-through, Titus." "Thank you, sir. Still, I'd rather be prepping to play than have your job," the young Minotaur said, handing his borrowed clipboard back to Reynolds. "No offense." "None taken, but here," Reynolds said, pushing the clipboard back to Titus. "Take it home with you, along with that playbook, and think up a couple of drills of your own to run these guys through tomorrow. Wednesday, let's try to get you back in uniform and on the field." Titus grunted his agreement and made his way back out to his truck to head home for the afternoon. His phone buzzed twice en route, and before he walked up the snow-dusted path from the driveway onto his parents' porch, he checked the screen, finding he had 2 new emails, one from some spam outfit, and another from his forensic professor, marked Hotep, Jenga, background. Titus headed into the house, swiftly slapping on his house hoof covers and taking off his coat, hanging it on its peg near the front door, and heading to the living room, where his mom sat comfortably watching some program quietly. Opening the attached files, Titus read through the information within, which didn't turn out to be either a surprise or much of anything that he hadn't expected, given that he assumed the man had been a former associate of Ashkar's. According to NCID records, Janga Hotep had been arrested, charged, and convicted on 5 different occasions for misdemeanors, once in Vermont, twice in Massachusetts, and twice in New York. Each time he'd only ended up serving 3 or 4 months in jail, with the most recent instance being a 3-month stay in the Erie County Correctional Facility in 2021 for an assault conviction that got pled down. He had been arrested and tried for attempted manslaughter in Massachusetts back in 2015, but the charges had been dropped, according to the file, due to a lack of physical evidence and the alleged victim withdrawing their complaint. The first name listed among his known associates in the file was, of course, Ashkar Sutek, though another name stuck out to him in the part of the file that covered Hotep's time in Boston: Patrick O'Connell. Titus wondered if this was the same O'Connell that Ashkar was currently working for. Per the last section of the file his forensics professor was able to put together for him, Hotep was presently under active investigation by the Buffalo Police Department for suspicion of ties or association with a retail theft ring operating in the area. There was also a self-storage unit rented in Hotep's name in the township of Eden, though without reasonable cause, no search warrant had yet been issued for the unit. Satisfied that there was nothing else to worry himself over in all of this, Titus copied the vital information that he imagined Ashkar would want, and sent this along to him in a note file attached to a text message. When the message registered as sent, he tucked his phone away, opened the Bengals' defensive playbook, and started studying the laminated pages within so that he might think up a drill of his own to try running the following day. Ashkar poured a customer his requested shot of whiskey and put a finger up to O'Connell, pulling out his phone and waggling it. The Boston native gave him a curt nod, and the Minotaur made his way to the back room, opening the message from Titus and the attached note document. A quick scan of the information Titus had included put him a little more at ease. If the worst thing Janga had going on at the moment was a few Buffalo PD eyeballs on him for potentially fencing some stolen goods from around the city, he could breathe easy. This was especially good given that apparently the Hobgoblin had been in the Buffalo area for a few years, though this was longer than Janga had indicated when he dropped by for that visit the day before. Probably didn't want me grumbling about him not coming to see me sooner, Ashkar thought. Could be worse, he mused aloud, tucking the phone back in his pocket. It was worse, though neither he nor the legitimate authorities who reported to the NCID knew that at the time. Misha scrutinized the image closely, tracing the tip of her pinky finger along a portion of the lower edge of the kite shield tattooed on Titus's arm. He'd managed not to scream when his teammates got hands on it during the previous afternoon's practice, though it did still hurt, but not enough to keep him off the field again. His attempt to put together his own drill on Tuesday had gone over about as well as a screen door being installed on a submarine, the result of which was a newfound respect for Coach Reynolds and his creativity in putting together a game plan on the defensive side of the ball. Titus could run a scheme, sure, but he had to have a framework to go off of. Creating something from scratch was not his strong suit. I don't recognize these first couple of words, but Jacobson is pretty obvious, she remarked, slowly drawing back to her side of the booth. Katie brought their drinks over and raised up her order pad. Your usual guys? The young waitress asked. Yeah, but could you have them add bacon to my burger today? Titus asked. Katie jotted down a quick note on her order pad with a nod. Same as always, Misha added. The duo handed over their menus, and Katie flitted away. So, anything new and exciting in your neck of the woods? Not a whole lot, really. I get to take my criminology final in a couple of weeks, right before Thanksgiving break. Profiling the second week of December, as well as statistics and procedure. Leaves my days a lot more open after Christmas break, which is good. And you've got a lot to consider before the middle of January, Misha added. Titus let out a heavy sigh. I don't even want to think about that right now, he breathed. How about you, hon? What's developing on your program? Misha snorted, a wry grin twitching the corner of her mouth. Well, you know how I've been dual streaming to both Rumble and YouTube? He nodded. Yeah, well, apparently the fine folks at Google still have a pretty sizable stick up their collective asses, because they took down my show from the other day and hit me with a community guidelines strike. What the hell for? They claim I made an offensive comment that could be construed as targeting people based on a protected classification, which is bullshit from top to bottom. All I did was make a joke. Titus gave her a brief look that requested clarification, and Misha deflated a little. Okay, I might have stepped on a rake a little bit, she said, looking away from him. Mish, what was the joke? Well, you know me, T. You've seen my show a few times. I try not to talk politics. I don't talk religion. I try to stay out of the whole culture wars territory as much as possible. But sometimes I respond to questions or comments from my chat, especially when it relates to something in the news. Even then, I'm almost always pretty good about hedging what I'm going to say in response. Yeah, I've noticed that. You're a lot more reserved online than you are off. That's pretty typical behavior for, well, everybody. Go on. Right. So, I have a decent number of viewers in the UK, and one of them asked what I thought about the whole grooming gang situation over there, Misha said, at which point Titus groaned aloud, hand pressing to his forehead, and slowly wiping down over his lower lip. Yeah, I had an open goal, T. I couldn't help myself. So I said, well, I think those guys are being really devout Muslims following in their prophet's footsteps by trying to rope mostly underage girls into sex slavery. Jesus, Mish, Titus said, through his own snickering, shaking his head. You see, though, you're laughing too. It's funny, and nobody's supposed to be immune to a bit of ribbing, right? I agree with that, but you know exactly why YouTube gave you the shepherd's crook, Titus said, his laughter tapering off. Besides, you've got to be careful who overhears that sort of thing. You don't want a fatwa put on your head and end up with someone yelling, Admiral Akbar, before running themselves at you with a suicide vest. The pair of them dropped into another spate of laughter, bringing themselves under control as Katie came to their table with their plates. Thanks, Katie, Titus said. So how long are you suspended off of YouTube? 1 week, which isn't all that bad, really. I never got the majority of my revenue off of them to begin with, thankfully, so it doesn't much matter. Speaking of money, though, there was one other thing to update you on. Oh? I finally found a studio apartment here in Hamburg, over near the Walmart, Misha said. $800 a month. It includes the electric, gas, and water, so all I have to pay for really is my phone and car insurance and groceries. That's not a bad deal. Did you already reach out? Yep, I just have to go fill out some forms this afternoon. Should hear back if I got the place within a week. My father won't want me to move out before Christmas, but he agreed that it's time for me to step out on my own, especially since I've got a nice little nest egg set aside. Their conversation was sparse after that as they finished their lunch, and when Titus got in his truck to head back to the campus, driving carefully as another light snowfall welcomed itself to western New York, Misha stood in the cold and watched his taillights fade off and disappear around a corner. She lit a cigarette and gave Katie a smile as the Hume waitress, wearing a puffy yellow winter coat over her Denny's uniform, pointed at her lighter, a cigarette jutting out between her lips as well. I didn't know you were back to smoking, Misha remarked. Yeah, I never really fully quit, Katie answered. She looked off the way Titus had gone and gave Misha a solemn glance. You know you haven't got much time left, Mish. You have to tell him. No, I really don't. He has a future ahead of him, and one hell of a choice to make about it, too. Misha took a long drag on her cigarette, looking down at the snow-pebbled sidewalk fronting the restaurant. I can't screw that up for him. She pitched her spent butt into the parking lot. I should never have said anything at that party. Yeah, but you did, and it may have flown under everyone else's radar, but not mine. Anyway, I think he may suspect anyway. What makes you say that? Well, we both grew up with him, Katie said, pulling out another cigarette and offering one to Misha, who took it gratefully. You know he's not stupid. Yeah, I know that. Flick, inhale, exhale. And you know that the whole bullheaded thing is more than just literal with Titus. There's a reason he went to school to be a cop. He's always been keen on getting to the bottom of things, figuring out what's what. He's more than just some brute, despite the rep loaded on his people, Katie observed. True, but if he knows, then why hasn't he said anything? That I couldn't tell you, Katie said with a shrug. It could be he's just had too much going on lately to find the time, or maybe he doesn't know how to broach the subject. Or he doesn't feel the same way and he's just trying to protect me, Misha said. A suspicion that she'd had for the better part of the last year, but tried to shove to the back of her mind. That's something else that drew him to that degree he's after. He's always wanted to protect people. Hell, it's what he does playing football. He's on defense. Katie patted her on the shoulder and turned to head back inside. Well, either way, Mish, you don't have forever if you're going to have the conversation. Better now than at the last minute.